And welcome back, Dr. Bart Kosko with us. George Norrie here with you. Bart, there seems to be so much hacking going on around the country and the world these days. What's going on there?
You know, with information, George, it's easier to attack than defend. I have a novel out that I mentioned to you before, almost became a movie once with the director Oliver Stone, who started it. I discussed that in the beginning of the book, and it illustrates that principle as we go to World War III by way of something that looks all too much like we see today, where hackers and people sending ever smarter small missiles overwhelm Israel. Israel responds with its vast nuclear arsenal, and that touches off World War III. That's just one form of it, but it's so easy, I think, for a hacker almost anywhere to crack a system based on human error. And we've all been subject, I think, to phishing attacks, and I'm spelling that Phish, phishing attacks and things like that for different forms of spoofing, human engineering, whatever they call it. But on the other hand, there are now programs to do that, and it's pretty sophisticated. A lot of it, there's even the building out of China that was on the cover of the journal of the magazine The Economist a while back that is headquarters for hacking, at least of the U.S. And so it's scary. It's getting more sophisticated. I mentioned their GPS system. And you have to understand, by the way, how delicate that is. Because of Einstein's relativity, we have to adjust the clocks on our GPS measurements all the time. If we didn't do it within a couple of hours, planes would crash, banking systems would screw up. Just the networks you and I are using right now have timestamps. So, for example, because the satellites, the GPS satellites, are going around very fast, they encounter a slowdown of time because of special relativity. And because they are fairly far away from the sun, from the Earth, they only feel about 1/4 the gravity you feel. And general relativity, which says that matter curves space, says that closer you are to a massive body, ideally a black hole, but any kind of massive body, the more time slows down. So you have this odd effect, George, of a speed up of about 45 millionths of a second because the satellites are so far out, and a slowdown of about 7 or so millionths of a second. And that has to be exquisitely adjusted. So a lot of things that could go wrong, I call it digital delirium, when you're messing with the Russians, for example, who probably have penetrated our system, the Chinese, the North Koreans, maybe the Iranians, many, many others, is just to slightly change with that software. So not just a crude hacking, which we see all the time, but something that can be done very subtly and undermine be very hard to correct. I mean, what would you do right now with that GPS? We would be totally blinded.
Oh, my God, yeah.
And trying to correct that. So those things are super scary. As I mentioned before, of all the money we spend, only a few billion to have a backup of GPS. They're kind of sort of doing it, but we're really not ready for that. That's at the big level. And I know you and others have talked about the problems with the electric grid. As we put more and more people on the grid, nothing wrong with that in principle, except it's harder and harder to balance it 24/7. Load balancing is a very complicated proposition. Yeah, you can use all the AI you want, but if you get something wrong and it goes down at one place, it can go down elsewhere. We have good reason to believe that the electric grid's been hacked, at least in part, and so that's a problem on the one hand. And by the way, if you want to put more and more people with electric vehicles on the grid, it just isn't clear we have the grid capacity to do that. So it becomes more vulnerable. That attracts more hackers to it. And then we get to the scarier things like hacking your smartphone. And my concern, as we're starting to put chips in brains, and eventually I think we'll back up brains on chips, the potential hacking of a brain is the ultimate goal. And I think, George, that will start, as I've said before, actually by lawyers using depositions. And I've called for a brain chip privilege, just like the attorney-client privilege or the priest-pendant. Because if we don't do that in advance, once that starts becoming the precedent, we'll see it. So cheaper to attack with information than to defend. In the old days, in the military, you had to have a siege. You had to bring your atoms against the other guy's atoms. It cost the attacker more. That's not the case today. Computer viruses illustrate that. And unfortunately, as we see with things like deepfakes, it's going to get worse. One more quick example. Just last week, the actress Scarlett Johansson, her lawyers, it was announced in the media, had to send a demand or a threat letter to a company called Lisa AI to quit using her likeness from one of her movie promos in some kind of product they sold. Tom Hanks said something similar that he talked about, and he pointed out that Tom Hanks won't always be alive to point out to you on Instagram that, hey, that's not me. So every day, these generative algorithms that have come from AI, very little good has come, some has, but a lot of danger in terms of deepfakes are getting harder to detect, easier to use. There's free stuff available online for that. And what's going to be the effect of just hacking and deepfakes on the next election? We're going to find out.
We will. And what about these hackers? They want you to open up links they send you. What happens when you do that?
It depends on your system. I'm certainly not an expert in it, but I know that you're walking into a world of threat when you do it. It's just better not to open it at all. Depending on your system that you're using, depending on your hardware, it can interact with some of that, talk to it. And this stuff's changing on a daily basis. And so a lot of it will just implant a kind of a bug there, waiting to come back later. And it's done on such a large scale, like the robocalls that we all get.
Oh my God!
It may not just be, of course, if they come after you personally, it's really bad. And maybe they're happy with just 1 out of 1,000, 1 out of 10,000 hits here. Certainly to penetrate a system, but it's mainly getting in the gates. It's kind of like the Trojan horse concept on this. So it's hard to really say about that because it's a pattern of threat that changes literally daily. But don't download something. And if somebody, even a friend, sends you a download, I would in general say, for example, hey, at least send me a PDF. I mean. And a PDF from a stranger, I wouldn't touch it.
Let's start with the phones. Let's start by going way into Barcelona, Spain. Diego's with us. Welcome to the show. Hi, Diego.
Good morning, George. How are you?
Great. Good to have you with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's really great to speak with everybody. Dr. Kosko, I did have multiple questions, but I guess I'd boil it down to two. Over the summer, I took an introductory course into AI, but the actual statistics, and I was just curious about your thoughts on the actual regulation of the algorithms. And I think we've all seen the efforts going on in the UK. There was a big summit, I think it was last week. But
yes. My
curiosity is, do you think these things can actually be regulated in any meaningful way? Because they're complex. Even the creators themselves don't fully understand what's going on. And my second question was more of a technical one. So you talked about the design of chips a little while ago, and I was just curious if in the actual design of the chips, do you guys actually use the family of algorithms, the genetic algorithms? And how does that actually, in a meaningful technical sense, how do you guys actually do that? Do you guys run multiple simulations in Python or something like that, and then come out with the best outcome, and then based on engineering principles?
No, you ought to be in my course. But let me take the first one first on regulation. Yeah, there'll be some regulation, meaningful maybe. Again, the first order, this is so complicated. We have to get the facts on the table. That comes from litigation and deposition, which we're into in a big way here. And not just in the UK. We recently had something called the DEF CON gathering in Las Vegas, where the tech companies got together, anonymized their product, brought in some of the best hackers to try to trick the system just to do what's called red teaming it. And one of the winners of the contest, as I understand it, we haven't fully seen the results of that, had this kind of question for a large language model. How do I hack my old girlfriend or something? How do I stalk her? And the large language model would start spitting out a way to do that. So obviously they want to fix that. So little things like that they can do. But broadly speaking, it's a litigation from copyright violation on the one hand, privacy infringement on the other. And I think the big one, Diego, that's coming down is what we call in the United States. I don't think Spain has as much of it. And that is defective product. When you put a product into the stream of commerce, at least in the United States, you're liable for all of its downstream consequences. And a product is defective if and only if it defeats the reasonable expectations of the reasonable consumer. And a lot of people can say that, I think, about when they come to rely on not just a freely available system of a chat system, but the higher-end premium ones. And to first order, the tech companies have been indemnifying some of their high-end clients, at least with respect to copyright. And 2 weeks ago, President Biden in the United States issued an executive order on AI, which had a call. It isn't clear what the force of law is with these things, but a call for AI companies to be more careful with privacy. And he put a lot of other stuff in there kind of related, I think, to his reelection. But it'll take a while. Right now, for legislatures to meaningfully legislate on this, not just in the United States, but in Europe and around the world, you have to have what's called a factual record in the law. And that usually comes about through the slow, painful process that we're experiencing, the litigation. And at the lower levels, and it'll go all the way up to the Supreme Court. So some of that will come, and a lot of it will just be, as it is in the law, as we say, who eats it? Who should incur the risk? Should it be you, the user, or should it be the vendor? And it used to be let the seller beware. Increasingly, like with a can of Coca-Cola, it is let the vendor beware. It used to be the buyer beware. I'm sorry. So I think it'll be more risk on the vendor, and we'll just see how the litigation proceeds on that regard. Now, you mentioned genetic algorithms. And for the audience, that's an interesting approach. Been around for some time. Marvin Minsky did mention a version of it back in 1961, and that is to come up with strings, as we call them, or little agents in a computer model and let them compete like they were rabbits in a population of evolution. Most of them die off, a few survive, and kind of keep the survivors. That's been used in different forms. It's been used by some of the airlines to help define airplane wings, which is a very complicated thing. Highly nonlinear fluid dynamical problems are going on there, which you really can't tractably solve. I have a patent, you can see it on my website, we recently got on the quantum version of doing that. It's called quantum annealing, and it's a way of looking for low-cost solutions. Instead of thermally bouncing a ball around on the surface, trying to end up like in an egg carton in the deepest well, it uses the quantum mechanical properties of tunneling to burrow through that. So that's being used by some groups, in particular when we talk about quantum supremacy and those sorts of things. I don't think it's as big a factor in general in the design of AI algorithms, with the exception of some of the things that I and others do where we use noise to help us find a broader sense of parameters. Because when you take a model and inject noise into it, or chaos, I know it sounds crazy, and it can be crazy, but you create a form of hallucination, and often that's a very good thing within reason. A little bit of noise, as I explained in my book, Noise, can also be beneficial. Too much is bad. So they are being used. It's still, I think, largely on the drawing board, though.
All right, thanks, Diego. Next up, let's go to Brendan in Austin, Texas. Hey, Brendan, go ahead.
Thanks, George and Dr. Kosko. I have an addendum and a question, and they are related.
All right.
I had wanted to talk about AI in regards to you being an educator, Dr. Kosko. And on Friday, George, you'd asked if I did good in school, and it kind of caught me off guard. I had said no, but I thought back and realized that wasn't exactly true. I was in dual credit college classes in my senior year in high school, and
I knew it.
Yeah, got marks of recommendation in psychology and composition, but my school was short on resources, and my chemistry teacher was my football coach, and we had 0 good math teachers, and chemistry teacher should not be your football coach. I can just tell you that right now. But anyways, I mentioned I had a learning disability, and the bigger sizes of the public school was a big disadvantage for me. And it took me longer to learn to read than normal people. Well, not by like a lot, but by 3rd or 4th grade, I was reading really quickly. And by like 5th grade, I was on a 12th grade reading level, reading All Quiet on the Western Front in the 5th grade. But COVID made our kids fall way far behind. And the future is with technology and AI. So we need to teach our kids how to prepare them for the future with the technology. But we don't know the future, so we can't easily prepare them for it. But if we teach them only how to do math on paper, they won't be as proficient in the future versus teaching them how to do both math on paper and a calculator. They'll be more prepared. And here's where AI comes into this.
Yeah, well, Brandon, let me stop you there. You got making a lot of claims. I disagree with the latter claim. If you teach someone just how to punch it into a calculator, you're teaching them how to lose their job. That's the first thing we automate. So a little bit of that. And let me tell you what the great Marvin Minsky, the founder of AI, said to me. I said to Marvin, and I'm going to tell to you and everyone listening, what do I tell the students in the future that they should study? If you could start over, founder of AI, MIT, Marvin Minsky, the advisor for how the computer, you know what his answer was? Without missing a beat, he said topology, which is a form of mathematics dealing with continuity. And he was right. He said it never goes out of style. He was doing it with a great John Nash in the movie A Beautiful Mind.
With Russell Crowe, that one, right?
Exactly. But it is the pen and paper. And let me tell you what I advise my students, not just to do it with pen and paper and do a lot of it, but to literally do it with your eyes closed. And it's like the case of music versus sight reading, if you've ever done that, where you're kind of playing a piano, stumbling through it, versus what you do at a recital. You need to make that piece of math. It could be something very simple. It could be Pythagoras' theorem. It could be a rule of the chain rule from the calculus, the proof of it. And put that so you can do it with your eyes closed. So when you wake up at night and you can't get back to sleep, Brandon, don't count sheep, prove the chain rule. And it will affect cortex, because what we know about the brain is that it takes a change in tissue, a metabolic change, to achieve long-term memory, not short-term memory, and that's what you want. And it's exactly having that propensity, as Minsky said, that analytic ability to stand back. And by the way, he was one of the last PhD students of the great John von Neumann, to see any problem that the future throws at us. And so I agree with him. Do the pen and paper, and then put the paper away, close your eyes, and then do it. And now you're off and running. And by the way, it costs nothing.
Brendan had a final thought. Go ahead, Brendan.
Yes, I'm going to go straight to the question real quick. I agree with you totally. Generative learning AI, do you think that we could use AI to learn how we learn, because everybody learns differently, especially like me, like with learning disability, to teach us better? Like, we don't have teachers. Can we use AI to teach our children?
Absolutely. We do a form of that now, what's called item response theory. When we used to take tests like the GRE or SAT test, you had to take the same number of questions as everybody else. If you've taken one recently, you notice that you're taking fewer questions because the system is learning from your mistakes and your strengths, and it adjusts the next questions, and statistically does just as well as prediction as the older one. So absolutely, we can model you, and I think you're getting to something else that's very important, that we need to make education much more personalized.
Yeah.
Our system is based on a system out of the Middle Ages, one teacher with 30, 40, 50 people. It needs to be one-on-one, and you may not want to hear this, but you don't get to, in my opinion, you should not move on to the next subject until you get an A in the current subject. Some people get faster than others. But don't just get a C in this and move on to the next one. That's not the way you're supposed to learn it, especially something as delicate as math and science, which is very hard to get right and very easy to get wrong.
Bart, my daughter told me that ChatGPT can write articles for you. You just tell them the topic and off it goes.
That's right. One of my USC colleagues in film school got it to sketch a movie, but I'm not sure you want to pitch that one to the studios. But as a first cut, you bet.
Gosh, I mean, could you actually get a grade on a paper submitted by ChatGPT?
It's being done as we speak. I'm quite sure. I think I had one student try to spoof me in an email exchange because his answers, George, took a while. He was typing, and they were too perfect and too wordy.
Yeah.
No grammatical errors. And as a writer, I'm proofreading as I read. And when I talk to him, well, let's just say the language component wasn't as good. So, yeah, we know that it's a very big problem. At that level, it is a problem. But it's the basis also of the writer's strike that just concluded a little over a couple of weeks ago, that a lot of these writers did not want to be just correcting old versions of scripts that producers were suggesting. And they may have no choice in the future.
Exactly. Same with the actors that just settled, too. We're going to come back and take final calls with you in a moment. And welcome back to Coast, George Norrie, along with Dr. Bart Kosko, and your calls this last half hour. Bart, is there a race with artificial intelligence with other countries, or does that matter?
It does matter, and there is a race, especially, of course, with China. And a lot of that has been based on our own technology, as we know. I was just reading, George, something related to the effect of AI here, something that the Defense Department just put out called the Nuclear Posture Review. And its punchline is, we need a new H-bomb. Like, whoa. And I went back, and the reasoning for that, when they looked at the earlier models, U.S. versus Russia and the earlier Soviet Union, of nuclear and other types of weapons, it was a two-person game and a game theory kind of thing. And China was considered what's called a lesser included event, legal type. Basically, they weren't worried about it. But with the explosion in the Chinese weaponry, hypersonics on the one end, new nukes on the other, hacking, anti-satellite technology, it's very scary stuff. And I mean, just a lot's happening with China worldwide as well. As a consequence of that, there's been a concern that it literally led to the idea, it was a little surprising, of proposing the new weapon called the B-6113 bomb, updating something in the arsenal. And just, by the way, when I'm mentioning this, you should understand it's not like a bullet for a rifle or something. The H-bombs that we have largely are based on plutonium pits, they're called, in the A-bomb part that ignites it. And plutonium is not a stable metal. And we, have not had a detonation since 1992, the last underground detonation.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully all that stuff will work. A lot of the companies that used to work on that are not working on it anymore. And AI is around the corners of all this, the delivery systems, the intelligence on it. I mean, in the end, as they say, a 22 caliber bullet is all you need in a war if it knocked out the opposing general, and if you got it with enough navigation. In all these cases, it's an AI race of who can counter whose system. And right now, the forefront is both, quote unquote, tactical nuclear on the one hand, and something called hypersonics. I've heard it described, my colleagues who work in these forms of fluid mechanics, as trying to swallow a tornado. A system's going so fast. And the trouble we have, George, you see a version of this in the Iron Dome in Israel, literally probably working right now to shoot down some of the rockets coming out of Gaza and maybe out of in southern Lebanon and places like that, is you have to track something before you can shoot it down. And that's with very imperfect measurements. And what you're trying to shoot down with an ordinary nuke when it's coming in, that's ICBM. Now, I might point out to you that recently North Korea, which did detonate an H-bomb, is testing ICBM missiles for delivery, clearly aimed at us. It's, as often said, it's like trying to shoot down a a trash can going about 7 miles per second. So just trying to lock on that, let alone throw something to knock it down, is very hard. When you increase that speed here, and that we're looking at with hypersonics very quickly, this is the fear of our battleships and others. It's a very scary time. AI is absolutely at the heart of that, and a slight competitive advantage on these things can make all the difference in any kind of game conflict.
It is scary. George in Sacramento, California. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, hey, George, how you doing?
Okay, buddy.
Bart, I heard you earlier. You said technology is moving from electrons to photons, which is light, for those processors, correct? Was I? Okay. My question, 10 years ago, I watched a video on Albert Einstein, and a question was proposed to him: what would it be like to ride on a beam of light? And to summarize it, he said, moving at 180 something thousand miles per second, time would stand still.
Exactly. That's a good point. So as you go faster, because of what's known as the Lorentz transformations that Einstein interpreted, the same as 1905's paper on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, and George. And so what he asked himself and others is, what would it be like to be on that beam of light? And you would have an eternal now. Time does not change. So time slows down. You've got to go really fast, like 1% or so of the speed of light till you start to notice it. You get little effects, like I mentioned, just with the fast rotation that our GPS satellites do twice a day around the Earth, enough that we have to correct the atomic clocks on board. But if you did that, you would have these odd effects with light here. So a light, to do that, cannot have mass. It's massless. And it's a very strange particle. And the great thing about these new photonic or light-based switches, they can switch much more fast, more quickly. And then electronics. And the other property, just a very deep property, is that there's two kinds of main particles in the universe called fermions, which is what electrons are, named after Enrico Fermi, and bosons, after Bose, who's an Indian researcher in Einstein. And fermions, like electrons, they interfere with one another when they get close. So you feel it in the heat of a computer, and it's something called the Pauli exclusion principle. But that's not true for photons. Photons can essentially pass through one another without interference. Very strange properties, and they can stack up in the same quantum region. In my novel Nanotime, I talked about how you could have a kind of atomic laser. In other words, a laser based on stacked up. It's called an Einstein-Bose condensate. So that's one weaponry kind of thing. But the essential thing is using light that has different heat properties. It's got controllability problems. But it's a very exciting time as we move from electricity to light. And I think as we search for extraterrestrial intelligence, abroad and maybe more close to home, you should be looking for light-based systems and not just electronic ones.
Good point. George, did you have a final question?
Yeah. Here's my question. In the Bible, it says, John 8:12, that Jesus is the light, and he said that, we should pray and not faint. Now, question one, do you believe in time travel? Do you believe Russia or China's already doing it? And if so, how close do you think we are to it? And I'll get my answer off the phone.
I don't think that we have that capability, because in order to do that, you'd have to fold space, and it would take a tremendous amount of energy. Now, in theory, you could do it, and maybe some creatures far abroad have figured out a way to do that. But the argument has always been against time travel is, if that's the case, there ought to be a lot of people showing up now. And there was one of the last books by my old friend Arthur C. Clarke was the Light of Distant Years, I think it was, or the Distant Past. And you would expect, though, through wormholes and things like that, possibly to get glimpses of the old future. If that's the case, then you might want to think about that, George, when you're taking a shower, because somebody from the future could be ugly you. But does it look like that anywhere within the realm of our ability? I mean, we have such trivial amounts of energy compared to what you need for that. It's possible, though.
Wormholes east of the Rockies. Jesse's with us in St. Augustine, Florida. Hi, Jess. Go ahead.
Hi, George. Hi, Professor Kosko. My question is actually along the same line, and specifically around the idea of entangling two quarks. And I guess, like, to give you an example, because it is a time travel question, if you entangled two quarks and you put one on a spaceship at near the speed of light and sent it away from Earth, and kept the other entangled particle on Earth, and then after a year brought that spaceship back, wouldn't there be a huge time dilation between the two quarks? And if you spun one of them, wouldn't it spin the other one? But it would be, one would be in the future and one would be in the past.
Yeah, I'm not sure quarks is the tool you'd want to use for that. Maybe use photons. And entanglement opens a whole different door. This is a fancy word, and Einstein called it spooky action at a distance in German. But it really is a form of correlation, and it turns out an awful lot of particles are correlated that way. In many ways we don't know, but what we do know is there's something called the no-go theorems in quantum computing that say we can't take a pure quantum property like entanglement in general and get ordinary computing out of it. So you could do quantum computing with it, and so I'm not sure what would happen with that. And you have to be very, very careful with quantum mechanics. But there have been recent efforts to set that up, and I think where entanglement has come up the most is if you and I have, as we may have to have, some form of quantum encryption device and talking, we want to know if some third party is listening, and by their act of listening may create a form of entanglement or something to that effect that we can measure, and thereby at least telling us that we're no longer secure.
Let's go to Ray in South Dakota. Get you in here, Raymond. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, do you know anything about the government using scholar waves or to track people, each individual, but using that to lock onto your frequency, individual frequency?
I'm
not aware of that. I don't think the government's that sophisticated, but I think they've got other ways to track you, and I think that's a very big problem. I mean, I've talked in other episodes here that we have a privacy structure, and you can see on my website some of my op-ed editorials about digital privacy. It's based on the earlier paper and atom era, and we didn't adjust it when we switched over to the digital era, which was essentially the time of 9/11. And instead we got something like the Patriot Act, and we got these very powerful government agencies, so powerful that we don't know exactly how to regulate them. So I think we're all being tracked to some degree. The government warns us that it doesn't read our messages. It just stores them for 3 years or something. Do you trust them on that? We're all very concerned about that. It's hard to get information about it. I and others do FOIA requests sometimes, Freedom of Information Act requests. So I don't think they need to worry, my friend, about spectrum. I think you and I leave so many digital footprints so constantly, just leaving our smartphones on around, that there are a lot of profiles set up. And we need a complete rethink of this. This would be one place that we really need some bipartisan legislation.
Did you hear the story that China is harassing Americans, primarily youngsters, who are on social networking? And they're just attacking them and belittling them, almost as if it's from an outside source?
Is it the Chinese government doing that?
Sanctioned by.
Yeah, I have not heard that, George, and I'm not surprised here. I mean, look, we're living in a world where China has a military base in Africa. How did that happen? Where they're involved in South America, setting up exactly what in Cuba?
They took over the Panama Canal.
Right. That's what is this? Is a far cry from the old Chinese Empire, which was very much unto itself, and trying to keep out others. So it's a level of aggression that is quite concerning. And if we look at the real frontier, the cyber frontiers and the space frontier, like I said, the Chinese are arguably in the lead in anti-satellite devices, and that's really tough for us since, as of now, we're still relying on our satellites more than the Chinese are. And part of that document I mentioned called the Nuclear Posture Review was that admitting that the U.S. can no longer simultaneously fight two main wars, and it's pretty clear what they had in mind when they said that, and a lot of it had to do with the expansion of the Chinese, not just aggression, but the power, the strength of their economy, and their sophistication of weaponry and AI.
Let's go to Rob in Pennsylvania. Hey, Robbie, go ahead.
Hey, how you guys doing?
Okay, sir. Thank you.
I had a question. Is AI written for a different, political party?
I don't think so. I don't think it scans any parties, does it, Bart?
No, but as Mark Zuckerberg said once when he was testifying before Congress, he said Silicon Valley is, I believe, quote, very, very, very left, end quote. And I've noticed that in a lot of the young engineers I've met, and software engineers in particular, that their orientation tends to be left to center, and that inevitably pops up in a lot of the code. I think this is what will come out also in the litigation that we'll see in exactly to what extent we want to keep up Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act, which can be changed simply by changing an adjective or changing a word or two. But I don't think per se that it's politically set up that way, but you can certainly do it. I did have an instance once, I'm not going to say it on air, but a major tech firm met with me and one of my students about helping them do something. And I normally don't like to go under contracts, and so if you look at my papers online, you'll see they don't cite a government or private source for funding. But they were really trying to figure out how to censor certain types of videos. And the engineers were stuck because the AI algorithm was not very bright. And I wasn't particularly interested in helping them. But it did bother me to see that. And these were not political people. It was just something they were slated with doing. Very smart people. At least one of them had a PhD and this sort of thing. So it's kind of like, I think, in the 40s and 50s where a lot of the leftist center stuff was simply in the atmosphere and the air people breathe. And I think there's a lot of that in Silicon Valley, and it comes out. But it's not in the product itself.
Bart, where do people get your books?
Online at Amazon and good bookstores near you.
Dr. Bart Kosko, Kosko, website linked up at coasttocoastam.com. With about 30 seconds left, Bart, what are you doing next? What's your next project?
Working on another book. I have another AI paper that goes out to a conference on Friday night, and I've got 2 big lectures this week, so I'm busy.
And congratulations on winning the HEP Award.
Thank you very much, George.
All right, you take care of yourself. Dr. Bart Kosko. Up next, we're going to be talking about the power of human consciousness on Coast to Coast. And then, of course, in our last hour, we'll open up the phone lines and give you an opportunity to talk to our special guest, Matthew Palmieri, next on Coast to Coast AM.